The day had started like any other. The FBI officer had a few errands to run and decided to stop by a local department store to pick up some household items. She walked in casually, blending in with the other shoppers. Her movements were calm, purposeful, yet relaxed. She pushed a small shopping cart down the aisles, carefully examining items as she went. The store was bright, with rows of neatly stacked shelves, the smell of cleaning products and perfumes filling the air. Families wandered past, children tugging at their parents' hands, elderly couples slowly making their way through the aisles, and employees restocked shelves while occasionally glancing at shoppers with polite attentiveness. As she moved through the store, she noticed a few products she had been meaning to buy for some time. She reached for a set of kitchen utensils, turning them over in her hands to check quality and price. Nothing seemed unusual at all, and she placed them gently into her cart. Next, she made her way to the cleaning supplies section, comparing the labels on various bottles of detergent, looking for the most effective yet gentle option for her home. Everything was normal. She thought briefly about what she would cook that evening and how she would arrange her home for the week ahead. The day was ordinary, peaceful, and calm. Then, without warning, her sense of normalcy was shattered. A store employee, someone she had not noticed before, approached her with a hesitant expression. He looked around nervously before speaking in a low voice. "Excuse me, ma'am."
Can I ask you something?
She turned her attention to him, smiling politely. "Of course. How can I help you?" The man hesitated, then lowered his voice even further. "I need to check with security. We have a suspicion." He trailed off, glancing at the store's security desk. Before she could ask what he meant, 2 police officers appeared, stepping quickly around shelves and approaching her. They looked tense, their eyes scanning her with suspicion. She immediately recognized their demeanor. It was the type of suspicion rooted in prejudice rather than evidence. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone sharp and accusatory, "we need to talk to you about an incident in the store. You're suspected of shoplifting." She froze for a moment, disbelief spreading across her face. Shoplifting? That was absurd. She had not taken anything illegally. She pushed her cart slightly aside, keeping her hands visible and calm. "I think there's been a mistake." "I haven't taken anything," she said clearly, her voice steady but firm. The officers ignored her explanation. One of them stepped closer, speaking louder now. "We need to search your belongings to make sure. Step aside from the cart and cooperate." Her heart did not race, but her mind sharpened immediately. She knew the situation could escalate quickly, if not handled correctly. She was trained to deal with high-pressure confrontations. She nodded slightly, keeping her voice calm. "I will cooperate, but I want to make sure this is done professionally and without unnecessary aggression." The officers exchanged a glance, perhaps noticing her calmness. It was unusual for someone being accused in this manner to remain composed. They motioned her toward the side of the store where the security desk was located. As they walked, she noticed other shoppers watching. Some looked concerned, others curious, but no one intervened. The atmosphere grew tense. People instinctively gave space, sensing that the situation could escalate. At the security desk, the officers began an initial search. They opened her shopping cart and carefully examined each item. The FBI officer stood silently, hands clasped in front of her, observing every movement. She knew that patience was key here. Reacting emotionally could worsen the situation. While the officers inspected the cart, she glanced around the store, noticing how her presence had captured attention. Store employees whispered among themselves, clearly unsure of what to do. A few customers whispered quietly, exchanging glances filled with disbelief. It was not every day that someone in plain clothes could suddenly be at the center of such a scene. As the search continued, one officer muttered under his breath, "Nothing here. Just regular shopping." His partner scowled but did not speak. There was a visible tension between the two, perhaps stemming from uncertainty. Their confidence, which had been apparent when they first approached her, seemed to be waning. The FBI officer spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "I am telling you, I have done nothing wrong. I understand you have a duty, but I also expect that you respect my rights." The officers hesitated slightly, but their suspicion had not faded. One of them, noticeably tense, gestured toward her coat and handbag. "We still need to check your personal items. Step aside and let us do a full search." She complied, but every movement was calculated. She had to maintain control of the situation without appearing confrontational. She slowly handed over her handbag, keeping her hands visible at all times. Inside, there were only normal personal items: a wallet, a phone, keys, a small notebook, and some personal care products. Nothing unusual. The officer who had accused her of shoplifting carefully inspected each item, flipping them open and closing them, examining them for any signs of wrongdoing. Her notebook, filled with work notes and schedules, was read briefly before being returned. Her phone was unlocked and checked, but there was nothing suspicious. Each moment was tense, but she remained composed. Her calmness was in sharp contrast to the officer's growing discomfort. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the store was changing. More people had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Children clutched their parents' hands. Some employees paused restocking to observe quietly. The tension was almost palpable. The FBI officer noted this not with fear but with clarity. Every movement mattered. Every word had an impact. The officer's demeanor began to shift. The arrogance they had carried when first accusing her started to fade. Their hands trembled slightly and their eyes darted nervously. It was subtle but noticeable. They were beginning to realize that the person they had accused so confidently was not ordinary. Still, they continued with the search, trying to maintain authority. They opened her coat pockets, checking inside for any hidden items. Each time they found nothing, their confidence waned further. The officer remained calm, her face neutral, showing no fear or anger. She understood that the key to navigating the situation was patience and composure. A small crowd had gathered by now. Shoppers whispered among themselves, and the employees watched silently. The officers began to sweat slightly, their faces pale in places. The FBI officer could see the hesitation creeping into their movements. They had underestimated her, assuming she would be nervous, flustered, or compliant without question. But she was neither. She was calm, professional, and fully aware of her surroundings. At one point, the officer who had first spoken to her muttered under his breath to his partner, "This doesn't feel right. Something's off." His partner nodded, a frown on his face, but neither stopped the search. They were trapped between protocol and their growing unease. The FBI officer took a breath and spoke again. "I am fully cooperating, but I want this to remain professional. I expect respect for my rights and for the truth to be recognized. I have done nothing wrong." Her words, delivered calmly and clearly, carried weight. They were not threats or accusations. They were facts backed by her presence, demeanor, and authority. The officers looked at each other, uncertainty written across their faces. The store manager approached quietly, unsure of how to intervene. He spoke softly, trying not to escalate the situation. "Officers, perhaps there's been a mistake. She seems to be cooperating fully." The officers barely acknowledged him. They continued their search, though now more hesitantly. The FBI officer watched carefully, aware that the tension had shifted slightly in her favor. The officer's confidence had been shaken by her calmness, and the more they searched, the more they realized that there was nothing to find. For nearly 20 minutes, the search continued in this manner. Every item in her possession was examined, every pocket checked. The crowd around them grew slightly, whispers spreading through the store. The officers' faces turned increasingly pale, and their movements became more hesitant. Their overconfidence had been replaced by doubt, confusion, and fear. Finally, after a thorough search, the officers paused. They had found nothing. Their suspicions, once so bold and unfounded, now seemed ridiculous even to themselves. The FBI officer remained composed, her posture straight, her voice calm, ready to assert her authority when the moment came. The first part of this story ends here, with the officers beginning to realize that they had misjudged the situation completely. The calm, professional demeanor of the FBI officer had started to turn the tide. The simple act of remaining composed, following procedure, and maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice had begun to unsettle the officers, setting the stage for what would soon become a dramatic turning point in this ordinary-looking day at the store. After the officers had finished searching her belongings and found nothing, the FBI officer remained calm, standing with her hands folded in front of her. She observed the scene quietly. The store had gone silent except for the faint murmurs of customers who were still watching the exchange unfold. The officers, once brimming with confidence, now shifted nervously from foot to foot. Their faces had lost the bold, aggressive expressions they had carried when they first approached her. Instead, there was visible unease, a quiet panic settling over them that grew with every second they failed to find anything incriminating. One officer cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of control. "Ma'am, we just need to ensure everything is fine," he said, his voice slightly wavering. The words were meant to sound authoritative, but the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. His partner looked equally uncomfortable, glancing around as if searching for a way to escape the situation. Their eyes kept darting to her badge, which she had not yet displayed, but which she was fully prepared to show if necessary. The FBI officer knew the officers were testing her patience, trying to gauge whether she would react emotionally or lose her composure. She had seen this many times before in her career. The key was to remain calm, professional, and unshakable. Any hint of frustration or fear could give them an opening to escalate further. She drew a slow breath, keeping her voice steady as she spoke. "I have cooperated fully, and I expect that the rest of this interaction remains professional. I have done nothing wrong, and I would appreciate that recognized immediately." The officers exchanged a quick glance. There was a tension between them now that had not been there at the start. They were used to being in charge, to having authority unquestioned. Here that authority had evaporated, replaced by doubt and confusion. They continued to inspect her coat and handbag, but their movements were less confident, almost hesitant. Each item they examined only reinforced the truth. There was nothing there, nothing at all. Around them, the store atmosphere was thick with tension. Customers who had initially looked on with mild curiosity were now openly watching, some whispering to each other in disbelief. A few had taken out their phones, discreetly capturing the scene. Employees hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene or simply stay out of the way. The store manager stood a short distance away, his expression tense, realizing that this situation could easily spiral out of control if not handled carefully. The officers then asked her to remove her jacket for a more thorough search. She complied slowly, carefully placing it over the counter, her movements deliberate and calm. She knew that remaining composed was essential. Any sudden action could be misinterpreted. One officer reached into the pockets while the other glanced around nervously, unsure of what to do next. They seemed caught between procedure and the growing awareness that they had misjudged this situation entirely. As the search continued, the officer spoke again, her tone measured but firm. "You have seen everything in my belongings. There is nothing suspicious here. I am asking that this ends now." Her words were not confrontational, but they carried an undeniable authority. She did not need to shout or make threats. Her presence alone was commanding respect. The tension in the room shifted slightly. One of the officers muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated. Why isn't she reacting? Why isn't she afraid?" His partner gave no answer, just tightened his jaw and avoided eye contact. They had assumed she would panic, comply blindly, or react emotionally. None of that had happened. Instead, they were facing someone who was completely calm, completely aware, and completely in control of the situation. At this moment, the FBI officer began to notice subtle cues in the officer's body language. Their hands were slightly trembling, their postures stiff. Their eyes kept flicking to her belt and the area where her badge was clipped under her coat. They were beginning to realize that the person they had accused was not an ordinary shopper. The realization brought a quiet fear into their movements. One of the officers cleared his throat again, trying to assert some control. "Ma'am, we just need to make sure everything is okay. This will only take a moment longer." His voice was louder this time, but there was an edge of uncertainty beneath the surface. The officer simply nodded politely, her calmness unshaken. "I understand your duty," she said, "but my rights must also be respected. I am asking again that this ends now. I have nothing to hide and I have done nothing wrong." The store had grown quieter. People were leaning in slightly, curious to see how this confrontation would unfold. Some whispered to each other, questioning why the officers were treating a shopper this way. Others watched silently, clearly impressed by the officer's composure. Even the store manager seemed to realize that the situation was no longer just a routine accusation of shoplifting. It was becoming a tense standoff, with the officers clearly losing control. The officers began to search her clothing more thoroughly. They felt the edges of her pockets, lifted the lining of her coat, and checked every accessible area. The FBI officer remained still, hands visible at all times, making no sudden movements. Her breathing was calm, her gaze steady. She knew that patience was her ally. Every moment the officers wasted searching without finding anything only strengthened her position. Time seemed to stretch. The officers' initial confidence had completely faded. Their faces were paler now, and they kept exchanging quick glances. The arrogance they had walked in with was gone. It was being replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. They were beginning to understand that they were in over their heads, but their pride and desire to maintain authority prevented them from backing down immediately. Finally, one of the officers spoke again, his voice quieter, almost uncertain. We still need to do a body search." His words hung in the air like a challenge, but there was an unmistakable tremor in his tone. The FBI officer understood immediately what this meant. It was a test, and they believed they still had the upper hand. But she also knew that this request was excessive, unnecessary, and could easily escalate into a dangerous confrontation if not handled carefully. She nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact. "I understand your concern. I will comply with a proper search, but I want to ensure that it is conducted professionally and with respect. Any unnecessary aggression will not be tolerated." Her words were calm, authoritative, and precise. They were not meant to threaten, but to clearly communicate that she was not an ordinary individual and that she was fully aware of her rights and the limits of police authority. The officers hesitated, clearly taken aback by her composure. One of them glanced at his partner, their eyes wide with uncertainty. They had assumed that fear or frustration would take over, but instead, she remained entirely composed, watching them closely, analyzing their movements, and waiting for the right moment to assert her authority. As they began the body search, the officer carefully documented each step in her mind. Every motion, every word, every hesitation would be important if the situation escalated further. She had training in handling hostile encounters, and she was using it now not with aggression but with careful precision. She remained calm, even as the officer's nervous energy became more apparent with each passing second. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine accusation of shoplifting had become a tense situation with high stakes. Shoppers watched quietly. Employees hovered nearby, and the store manager stood at a distance, clearly unsure how to intervene. The officers, once confident and aggressive, were now visibly uncomfortable, their faces pale, their movements hesitant. The FBI officer could see the fear growing in their eyes. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. They were realizing that they had misjudged her completely. They had assumed that their authority alone would compel compliance. But now they understood that they were facing someone who was trained, skilled, and fully aware of the dynamics at play. Despite the tension, she remained calm. Her voice was steady, her posture composed. She did not raise her voice, she did not make sudden movements, and she did not allow the officer's aggression to provoke her. She was in control of herself, and slowly, she began to influence the control of the situation itself. The body search continued, but with growing hesitation from the officers. Each empty pocket, each found item of everyday use reinforced their realization that they had acted too quickly, too aggressively, and without proper cause. Their faces turned even paler, their confidence slipping further with each passing moment. By the end of what felt like an eternity, the officers had completed their search. They had found nothing, and yet they had wasted precious time, energy, and authority on a baseless accusation. The FBI officer remained calm, collected, and fully in control, her presence commanding attention and respect from everyone around her. The stage was now set for the next crucial moment, the moment when the officers would fully realize the gravity of their mistake, and the power dynamic would shift completely. But for now, the tension hung in the air, a quiet storm as the FBI officer stood, composed and unshaken, in the midst of the department store that had suddenly become a scene of high-stakes confrontation. After the officers had completed their thorough search and found nothing, the tension in the store did not disappear. If anything, it grew heavier. The FBI officer remained composed, standing tall, her hands relaxed but visible, her gaze steady. Every movement she made was deliberate, measured, and calm. She knew that the officers were struggling with the realization that they had made a mistake. Their initial confidence had crumbled, and now they were beginning to show subtle signs of fear and confusion. The store around them had become a silent witness to the unfolding scene, Other shoppers had stopped moving through the aisles, many standing frozen in place, unsure whether to continue shopping or leave. A few had taken out their phones, discreetly recording what was happening. Even the employees had paused, their work forgotten for the moment as they watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of awe and concern. The store manager hovered at a distance, frowning, clearly torn between letting the officers complete their duty and intervening to prevent further escalation. The FBI officer noticed all of this and remained unshaken. She had been in high-pressure situations before, and she knew the importance of keeping her composure. Her calmness was slowly influencing the dynamics of the encounter. Where the officers had once held all the perceived power, the balance was beginning to shift. Their faces, once bold and confident, were now pale, tight, and strained. Their bodies showed hesitation in every movement, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on them. One officer tried to reassert authority. "Ma'am, we still need to perform a full-body search. It's standard procedure." His voice was firmer than before, but there was an unmistakable quiver at the edges. He glanced at his partner for support, but his partner's expression was one of uncertainty. The officer's boldness had dissipated. His attempt to regain control was faltering before it even started. The FBI officer nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact with both of them. "I understand your procedure, but I am asking that it be done respectfully and professionally. Any unnecessary aggression will not be tolerated. I expect this to be resolved quickly, as there is nothing to find." Her words were calm but carried weight, and they made the officers pause. They were no longer just in a routine search. They were confronting someone trained to handle situations like this with precision and authority. The officers hesitated. One muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated, "Why? Why isn't she scared? Why isn't she panicking?" His partner said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw and the flicker of worry in his eyes betrayed him. They were realizing that they were facing more than just a regular shopper. They had misjudged her completely, and now they were unsure how to proceed without making the situation worse. Despite the tension, the FBI officer remained calm. She slowly placed her jacket over the counter and allowed the officers to inspect it once again. Though she knew they would find nothing, she knew that their growing unease was visible to the people around them. Each shopper, each employee, each person who had stopped to watch was now silently aware that something unusual was happening. This was no ordinary confrontation. It was a clear display of authority, composure, and professional training in action. The officers began a more thorough body search, but their movements were tentative, hesitant. Their hands trembled slightly and they avoided making direct eye contact with her. They were realizing that they had underestimated her, that their aggression and bias had clouded their judgment, and that they were now the ones at a disadvantage. Their initial confidence had been replaced by doubt, uncertainty, and a growing awareness that they were being watched by not only her, but by everyone in the store. As the search continued, the FBI officer remained silent, allowing the officer's discomfort to build. She did not raise her voice or react emotionally. She simply stood there, composed and in control, observing every movement. She knew that any unnecessary words or actions could escalate the situation, and she wanted to avoid that at all costs. Her calmness was now a powerful tool, influencing the entire scene. The first officer, clearly struggling to maintain authority, spoke again. "Ma'am, we need to be thorough. It's for your safety and ours." His words were intended to sound reasonable, but the underlying fear was unmistakable. The second officer avoided speaking, his eyes shifting nervously between her, the first officer, and the growing crowd of onlookers. Their uncertainty was becoming more obvious with each passing moment. The FBI officer continued to comply, allowing the search to proceed. She understood that patience was key. She observed the officers carefully, noting every hesitation, every glance, every sign of discomfort. They were beginning to realize that the situation was no longer in their control. Their actions were being guided not by authority but by their growing fear and uncertainty. As the search reached its peak, the officers' body language began to betray them further. Their movements became slower, more deliberate, as if they were afraid of making a mistake. Their faces were pale, their hands trembled slightly, and their posture had stiffened. They were no longer acting with confidence or authority. They were reacting to the presence of someone who was clearly trained, highly skilled, and fully aware of the dynamics at play. The FBI officer took a slow breath, maintaining her composure. She could sense the shift in power. Where the officers had once held all the perceived authority, now she had gained the upper hand simply by remaining calm and professional. Their fear was growing, and with it, the realization that they had misjudged the situation completely. The store had become unusually quiet. Even the whispers among shoppers had slowed to a tense hush. Employees watched intently, some shifting nervously from foot to foot. The store manager moved closer, sensing that the situation was reaching a critical point. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement that something significant was unfolding. The first officer, clearly aware of the changing dynamics, attempted once more to assert control. "Ma'am, this will only take a few more minutes. We just need to make sure there is nothing dangerous on you." His voice was firmer than before, but the quiver was still there. The second officer nodded, but his eyes betrayed his fear. They were facing a situation far beyond what they had anticipated. The FBI officer remained composed, her gaze steady. She knew that the next moments were crucial. She allowed the search to continue, observing carefully and making no sudden movements. Every action, every word, every expression mattered. She was fully aware that she was not only defending herself, but also sending a powerful message about professionalism, authority, and the consequences of bias. The officer's hesitation grew more pronounced. Their hands moved slower, their eyes darted nervously, and their confidence had evaporated entirely. They were beginning to realize that their initial accusation had been baseless, their approach aggressive, and their judgment clouded by bias. They were in over their heads, and they knew it. The FBI officer allowed the search to conclude, her posture relaxed but vigilant. She did not gloat, she did not raise her voice, she simply maintained her composure. The officers, meanwhile, were visibly shaken. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling slightly, and their body language betrayed their fear. They had underestimated her completely, and the reality of their mistake was now undeniable. The crowd of shoppers who had been watching quietly now began to whisper among themselves. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, while others simply observed in silence. The employees shifted uneasily, sensing the gravity of the situation. Even the store manager seemed tense, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond a routine shoplifting accusation. Finally, the body search concluded. The officers had found nothing, and the truth was undeniable. The FBI officer had cooperated fully, maintained her composure, and allowed the search to proceed without incident. The officers, meanwhile, were left with the stark realization of their error. Their faces were pale, their confidence shattered, and their authority completely undermined by the simple presence of someone who knew how to handle such situations. The FBI officer took a slow step back, her expression calm, neutral, and authoritative. She allowed a moment of silence to settle over the store, letting the gravity of the situation sink in for everyone present. The officers exchanged quick, nervous glances, their previous arrogance replaced by fear and embarrassment. They had been thoroughly tested, and they had failed to recognize the authority and composure of the woman they had accused. This moment marked the turning point. The officers were no longer in control. They had realized, perhaps too late, that their actions had been misguided, their judgment flawed, and their bias had led them astray. The FBI officer, by contrast, had remained calm, professional and in control, demonstrating the power of composure, patience, and awareness in high-pressure situations. The stage was now set for the next part of the story, one where the officers would fully confront the consequences of their actions. The crowd would witness the revelation of her true identity, and the balance of power would shift completely. But for now, in this quiet, tense moment, the FBI officer stood calm, collected, and fully aware that she had maintained control of the situation through nothing more than her training, patience, and professionalism. The tension in the store thickened as the officers continued their search. The FBI officer remained calm, composed, and fully aware of the shifting dynamics around her. She had been trained for situations like this, but even with all her experience, there was no denying the discomfort of standing accused falsely in public. Her mind, however, stayed focused, and her every movement was deliberate. She kept her hands visible, her posture straight, and her gaze steady. Every detail mattered. Around her, shoppers had stopped what they were doing. Some whispered quietly to each other, uncertain about what they were witnessing. Others simply watched in silence, unable to look away. The air was thick with unease. Employees had paused restocking the shelves, observing the unfolding confrontation with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The store manager, standing a short distance away, fidgeted nervously, torn between wanting to intervene and not wanting to overstep. He knew the situation had escalated beyond a typical shoplifting accusation, and he could sense that something significant was about to happen. The officers, who had arrived confident and assertive, were now beginning to lose their composure. The first officer's jaw tightened, his hands slightly trembling. He had approached the situation with the assumption that fear or surprise would keep her compliant. That assumption had been proven entirely wrong. The second officer, equally uncomfortable, avoided eye contact and shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure how to proceed. They had underestimated the calm authority of the woman in front of them, and it was becoming painfully clear. "Ma'am," the first officer said, attempting to sound firm, "we still need to do a full-body search. It's routine procedure." There was a noticeable quiver in his voice, betraying his unease. The second officer nodded silently, his own confidence dwindling. They were caught in a delicate balance. If they insisted too strongly, they risked escalation. If they hesitated, they risked appearing weak or incompetent. The FBI officer took a slow breath and responded evenly, without raising her voice. "I understand your procedures. I will cooperate with a professional and respectful search, but I expect it to be done calmly and appropriately. Any unnecessary aggression is not acceptable." Her words were deliberate, measured, and calm. She didn't need to shout or threaten. Her tone, her posture, and her presence communicated authority more powerfully than words ever could. The officers exchanged quick glances, clearly unsettled. They had assumed that this encounter would be simple, routine, and unchallenging. They had expected compliance, fear, or at least hesitation. Instead, they were facing someone who remained composed, aware, and in full control of the situation. That realization was unnerving, and it was written plainly on their faces. Their hands moved slower, their gestures more hesitant, and their eyes darted nervously, trying to gauge her reaction with increasing difficulty. The search began again, more thoroughly this time. Though the officers' movements were cautious, they checked her coat pockets and handbag, flipping open compartments and inspecting contents that were entirely ordinary. Every time they found nothing, their unease grew. Their previous confidence was replaced with a creeping doubt. Each passing moment reminded them that they were dealing with someone who had experience, training, and knowledge far beyond their assumptions. The FBI officer remained silent, her gaze steady, allowing the officer's discomfort to mount. She understood that words were not always necessary. Her calm presence alone highlighted their mistakes, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain their authority. The subtle shift in power was evident. Where they had once approached her with unquestioned control, now they were hesitant, uncertain, and plainly uncomfortable. A small crowd had gathered, curious about the escalating scene. Some shoppers leaned closer, trying to understand what was happening. Others whispered quietly, remarking on how unusually calm the woman remained. The employees continued to watch with tense expressions, and the store manager moved a few steps closer, aware that this situation could easily spiral if not handled carefully. The FBI officer noticed all of this. Her awareness of her surroundings was precise, and she adjusted her posture slightly to remain composed while observing every reaction around her. One of the officers muttered under his breath, frustration and confusion clear in his tone. Why isn't she scared? Why isn't she panicking?" His partner did not respond verbally, but the subtle shake of his head and the shift of his eyes to the floor betrayed his concern. They were facing an uncomfortable truth. They had misjudged her entirely. They had assumed that their authority, combined with a bias-driven assumption of compliance, would control the interaction. It hadn't. The FBI officer, noticing the officer's hesitation, decided to maintain her silence for a few moments longer. Patience was a tool as powerful as any badge or authority. She could feel the subtle shifts in the officer's posture and energy, their hands trembling slightly, their breathing a bit uneven, and their eyes frequently flicking toward her, as if trying to gauge her next move. She stayed composed, calm, and fully in control of her own reactions, knowing that each moment of quiet observation was slowly increasing her influence over the situation. The first officer tried again, his tone more strained this time. "Ma'am, we just need to finish the body search. It's for your safety and ours." His words were meant to assert control, but the underlying fear was unmistakable. The second officer nodded but did not speak. Both of them were now clearly unsettled. Their initial aggression and confidence had been replaced with hesitation, uncertainty, and a growing awareness of the error they had made in approaching her so aggressively. The FBI officer complied, allowing them to complete the body search, but her composure never wavered. She maintained a neutral expression, her breathing even and her hands visible at all times. She understood that calmness was her ally, and that by remaining steady she could subtly influence the officer's behavior. Every pause, every controlled gesture, and every carefully measured word contributed to the shifting power dynamic. As the officers moved through the search, the FBI officer could see the pale fear growing on their faces. Their arrogance had crumbled, replaced by the dawning realization that they had overstepped. Their confidence, once so loud and bold, was gone. They were now painfully aware that the person they had accused was not ordinary, that she was highly trained, and that their actions had been misguided from the start. The crowd around them, once merely curious, had now grown tense. Whispers passed quietly among shoppers, and some employees exchanged concerned glances. The store manager moved closer, aware that what had begun as a simple accusation of shoplifting had escalated into something much more serious. The FBI officer, aware of all this, did not act hastily. She understood that every second allowed the tension to build, allowing the officers to confront the gravity of their mistakes without further conflict. The first officer's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the hem of her coat to ensure nothing was concealed. His partner avoided looking directly at her, focusing instead on the items they had already inspected. They were now fully conscious of the fact that this was not just an ordinary encounter. The weight of the situation was pressing down on them, and they had no idea how to regain control without causing a scene. The FBI officer spoke again, her voice calm, precise, and authoritative. "I have complied fully. There is nothing to find. I am asking that this search be concluded professionally and without unnecessary aggression." Her words carried weight without aggression. They reminded the officers that she understood her rights and expected them to act within the bounds of professionalism. The officers glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of her statement. Their hesitation increased. Each empty pocket, each ordinary item found only reinforced the reality that they had made a serious error in judgment. They were no longer confident. They were cautious, hesitant, and visibly uneasy. The shift in authority was unmistakable. The person they had assumed would be intimidated or flustered was calm, professional, and fully aware of their missteps. Finally, the officers completed the search. Every item had been checked, every pocket examined, and nothing suspicious was found. The FBI officer had remained composed throughout, her presence commanding respect and subtly altering the balance of power. The officers, once aggressive and confident, were now pale, nervous, and clearly aware of the consequences of their actions. The stage was now set for the next crucial moment, the moment when the FBI officer would fully assert her authority and the officers would begin to grasp the seriousness of their mistake. The store, the shoppers, the employees, and the manager all sensed that something significant was about to unfold. The FBI officer stood calmly, silently asserting her presence, knowing that the next moment would change everything. This quiet, tense pause marked the end of the initial confrontation. The officers had realized their error, their confidence had been shaken, and the balance of power had shifted. The FBI officer, through patience, composure, and professionalism, had begun to reclaim authority in a situation that had initially seemed entirely against her. The next phase would reveal her true identity, the full scope of the officer's mistake, and the dramatic turning point that would leave everyone in awe. The store was unusually quiet now. The initial tension had shifted into a heavier, almost electric stillness. The FBI officer stood calmly, her presence commanding the space around her. She had allowed the officers to complete the search, and as expected, they had found nothing. Every empty pocket, every ordinary item in her bag had made their previous accusations seem increasingly absurd. Yet she knew that the moment of revelation had not yet come. The officers still clung to a shred of authority, and the crowd still held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. She reached slowly for her badge, her movements deliberate and controlled. She did not rush, she did not fumble, and she did not appear dramatic. Instead, she acted with quiet confidence. Her hand moved to the inside of her jacket, retrieving the badge in a manner that conveyed professionalism rather than aggression. The officers noticed immediately. Their eyes widened slightly, their hands paused mid-motion. Something in the way she moved suggested that she was not just an ordinary shopper. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but carrying undeniable authority, "I believe it is time for you to fully understand who you are dealing with." She opened her jacket slightly and held up her official FBI badge. The metal glinted under the store lights, and her credentials were visible to everyone around. The officers froze. Their previous expressions of hesitation and unease were now replaced with shock, confusion, and a creeping panic. The first officer's face went pale, and he swallowed hard. His partner stepped back slightly, his hands trembling. They had assumed that this encounter would be routine, that their authority and aggression would be unquestioned. They had been entirely wrong. They had accused someone of shoplifting without cause. They had treated her with bias and suspicion, and now they realized that the person they had humiliated in front of a crowd was an FBI agent. The reality hit them like a physical blow. The FBI officer did not raise her voice or make demands. She simply held her badge with a calm, steady hand, allowing the officers and everyone in the store to see it clearly. Her composure amplified the gravity of the moment. The officers were no longer in control. They were standing in front of someone who could hold them accountable in ways they had never anticipated. Their previous confidence had been shattered entirely, replaced by fear, embarrassment, and a dawning awareness of the consequences of their actions. A murmur ran through the crowd. Shoppers who had been observing quietly now whispered to one another. Some gasped softly, while others simply exchanged wide-eyed looks. The employees, previously tense and uncertain, now seemed relieved to see the situation being clarified. The store manager stepped closer, his eyes on the FBI badge, realizing that the earlier accusations and tension were entirely misplaced. The officers, however, were still frozen, unable to move, speak, or regain their composure. The FBI officer spoke again, her voice calm, authoritative, and precise. "I have fully cooperated throughout this process. I have allowed a thorough search of my belongings and myself. You have seen that there is nothing illegal or suspicious here. Your accusations were unfounded and your behavior has been inappropriate." She paused, letting the words sink in. Every eye in the store was now fixed on the officers, who were shifting uncomfortably, their faces growing even paler. The first officer attempted to speak, but his voice was weak, faltering. "Well, we didn't know. He stopped, unable to finish his sentence. His partner's jaw tightened and he avoided eye contact completely, staring instead at the floor. The embarrassment and fear were now visible, a stark contrast to the arrogance they had displayed when approaching her. Their assumptions of control and authority had completely collapsed in the face of truth and professionalism. The FBI officer continued, her tone calm but firm. "You were responsible for ensuring the safety and respect of everyone in this store. Instead, you allowed bias and assumptions to guide your actions. That is not acceptable and it has consequences. I expect accountability for this behavior." She did not shout, she did not scold, but the weight of her words was undeniable. The officers now understood that their mistake was serious, and they felt the full force of their error without a single raised hand. The crowd continued to watch silently, witnessing the dramatic reversal of authority. The FBI officer's calm presence, combined with the visible authority of her badge, had shifted the entire dynamic. The officers were no longer figures of power. They were now individuals who had made serious mistakes, confronted by someone trained to hold them accountable. Even the shoppers, who had been bystanders at the beginning, now understood the severity of what had transpired. One officer took a small step back, his shoulders tense. "Ma'am, we apologize. We didn't know." His words were hurried, uncertain, and hollow. The FBI officer did not immediately respond. She allowed the silence to stretch, ensuring that the weight of the moment fully registered. The officers had not just been mistaken. They had been biased, aggressive, and entirely unprepared for the reality of the person they had confronted. Finally, she spoke again. "Acknowledgement is only the first step. Proper action must follow. Your department needs to understand the seriousness of what occurred here, and your behavior must be addressed accordingly. Her words were calm, steady, and firm. There was no anger, only authority. The officers' pale faces told her everything she needed to know. They now understood the gravity of their actions and the consequences that could follow. The officers shifted awkwardly. They were trapped in their own discomfort, unable to speak confidently, unable to reclaim authority. The realization that they had treated an FBI officer, a highly trained federal agent with bias and aggression in front of a crowd, was overwhelming. They were fully aware of how this would reflect on them, their careers, and their reputations. The store manager approached cautiously, acknowledging the FBI officer with a slight nod, silently indicating that the situation was now under her control. The FBI officer maintained her composure, allowing the officers to absorb the consequences of their actions. She did not gloat, she did not shout, she simply stood firmly, her badge visible, her demeanor calm and professional. Every shopper in the store could see the clear difference between the authority of someone trained, experienced, and calm, and the faltering, uncertain behavior of those who had assumed control without reason or justification. The first officer finally managed to speak again, his voice almost inaudible. We understand, we were wrong. His partner nodded, staring at the floor. The FBI officer acknowledged their statement with a small nod, signaling that while acknowledgement was necessary, it was not sufficient. Accountability and corrective action would follow. She had demonstrated authority, patience, and composure throughout, and now the officers would have to face the consequences of their mistakes beyond the store walls. The crowd's murmurs grew slightly, the energy in the store shifting from tension to curiosity and relief. Shoppers exchanged looks, silently recognizing the extraordinary calm and authority the FBI officer had displayed. The employees relaxed slightly, no longer fearing immediate escalation but still aware of the importance of professionalism in the aftermath. The store manager remained nearby, quietly relieved that the confrontation had been resolved without incident. The FBI officer continued to stand calmly, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes scanning the officers to ensure that the lesson had been received. Her presence alone had conveyed a message far stronger than any words could. Bias, aggression, and assumptions had no place in professional conduct. The officers, visibly shaken, had been confronted with that truth in front of witnesses, and they could feel the weight of accountability pressing down on them. One of the officers finally muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "We didn't realize." His partner nodded, still avoiding eye contact. The FBI officer's calm gaze did not waver. She understood that the acknowledgement of wrongdoing was the first step, but real change would require reflection and consequences. She remained patient, allowing the moment to resonate fully. The store manager, sensing that the situation had stabilized, spoke quietly to the officers. "I think it's clear now what happened. We need to move forward professionally." The officers nodded silently, still visibly uncomfortable. They were now aware of the gravity of their behavior and the impact it had had on the people around them, including the shoppers, employees, and most importantly, the FBI officer herself. The FBI officer finally lowered her badge slightly, her expression calm and neutral. She had asserted her authority without aggression. She had remained composed under pressure, and she had allowed the officers to recognize the full scope of their mistake. Her training, patience, and professionalism had turned what could have been a dangerous confrontation into a controlled and powerful lesson in accountability and respect. As she prepared to leave the immediate area, she spoke one final time. "Remember this moment. Your actions have consequences. Professionalism, respect, and fairness are not optional. They define how you are remembered both by your peers and by the public." Her words were calm, deliberate, and resonant. The officers remained silent, their faces pale and tense, fully aware that they had learned this lesson in the most direct way possible. The crowd slowly begs. After the incident in the store, the FBI officer knew that the situation was far from over. While she had maintained composure and authority in front of the officers and witnesses, there were formal procedures she needed to follow to ensure accountability. She stayed calm, even as her mind reviewed the steps ahead. First, the officers needed to understand that their behavior had crossed the line. Second, the department they worked for would have to be informed. And third, she would ensure that this incident could serve as a reminder of professionalism, fairness, and respect for all future encounters. She exited the store slowly, maintaining her professional demeanor. Customers who had been observing the confrontation whispered quietly among themselves as she passed. Many gave her discreet nods of respect, sensing the weight of what had just occurred. Employees followed with watchful eyes, their expressions a mixture of relief and admiration. Even the store manager, standing near the entrance, acknowledged her with a small nod, silently expressing gratitude that the situation had been handled without further escalation. Once outside, she reached for her phone to contact her local FBI office. She knew it was important to report the incident immediately. The officers involved had committed a serious error, fueled by bias and assumptions, and it was crucial that the situation was documented officially. She spoke clearly and calmly as she relayed the details: the date, time, location, the officers involved, the sequence of events, and the outcome. Her report was factual, precise, and professional. She included observations about the officers' initial behavior, their unwarranted accusations, and the public nature of their actions. While she made the call, she reflected on the officers' reactions. The look on their faces when her badge was revealed would stay with her. It was the moment when arrogance and bias collided with truth and authority. Their expressions had shifted from confidence to panic in seconds. The officers' behavior had demonstrated the dangers of assumptions, and the incident had become a lesson for them in humility and accountability. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly perception could change once the truth was revealed, and how important it was to maintain fairness and professionalism at all times. After reporting the incident, she documented it further in a formal written report. She detailed the officer's approach, the search of her belongings, the crowd's reactions, and the escalation that occurred before her credentials were revealed. She also noted the tone of her interactions, emphasizing that she had remained composed, professional, and non-confrontational throughout. Every word mattered, as the report would serve as a reference for internal review and potential disciplinary actions against the officers. Meanwhile, the officers returned to their department, still visibly shaken. The memory of the encounter lingered in their minds. They replayed the moment they had falsely accused an FBI officer, the awkward search of her belongings, and the overwhelming sense of authority and calm she had displayed. The embarrassment was compounded by the knowledge that witnesses had been present throughout the ordeal. Their peers would hear about it, and the consequences would likely follow. They could no longer rely on assumptions, aggression, or bias to assert control. This incident had changed their understanding of accountability forever. Back at the store, local authorities and the department store's management began reviewing the situation. The employees who had observed the incident provided statements describing the officers' behavior, the FBI officers' composure, and the reactions of shoppers. Their accounts were consistent, highlighting how calm and professional the FBI agent had been, and how visibly shaken the officers became when confronted with the truth. Even without knowing her official title initially, witnesses could clearly see that she commanded respect through her presence and actions. The FBI officer, after filing her reports, reflected on the importance of what had happened. She knew that public encounters like this could escalate dangerously if not handled carefully. She had turned a potential conflict into a demonstration of authority and professionalism. Her actions had not only protected herself, but had also provided a powerful lesson for the officers involved and anyone else who witnessed the event. Maintaining composure, asserting authority respectfully, and handling the situation with patience had been critical in achieving this outcome. Days later, the officers were formally reviewed by their department. Internal Affairs conducted interviews, cross-referencing statements from the FBI officer, witnesses, and store personnel. The review found that the officers had acted inappropriately, using bias and assumptions rather than evidence. Their behavior had violated professional standards and led to public embarrassment for the department. The consequences were serious. Disciplinary actions were recommended, including mandatory retraining, suspension, and close monitoring of future conduct. The officers realized that their previous behavior had jeopardized not only their credibility, but also their careers. The FBI officer received confirmation from her office that the report had been received, reviewed, and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. She had done everything correctly, documenting the situation meticulously, remaining composed under pressure and ensuring that accountability would be enforced. It was a relief to know that the officer's misconduct would not be overlooked and that corrective measures were being taken. This knowledge reinforced her belief in professionalism, procedure, and the importance of standing firm in moments of injustice. The aftermath of the incident also sparked conversations among law enforcement professionals and the public. Many discussed how bias and assumptions could lead to serious mistakes, emphasizing the importance of training, awareness, and accountability. The story of the FBI officer's composure and the officer's misjudgment circulated as an example of how professionalism, calm authority, and proper conduct could prevent escalation and ensure justice. Even those outside the immediate situation were learning a valuable lesson about respect, authority, and accountability. In her personal reflections, the FBI officer considered the broader impact of the event. While the incident had been stressful, it had also demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and calm authority. She had seen firsthand how maintaining composure could shift the balance of power, even in situations that initially seemed threatening. The officer's reactions had shown the dangers of assumptions and aggression, and the public witnesses had gained a clear understanding of how professionalism could prevail in tense circumstances. The FBI officer also thought about the future implications for the officers involved. They would have to navigate the consequences of their actions carefully. Retraining would challenge their assumptions, disciplinary measures would remind them of their responsibilities, and public awareness of the incident would likely influence how they approached future situations. The encounter had not only been a personal test but also a teaching moment for them, albeit a difficult and humbling one. Meanwhile, the store had returned to normal operations, but the memory of the incident lingered. Employees spoke quietly about how the situation had unfolded, noting the contrast between the officer's initial confidence and their eventual discomfort. Shoppers who had witnessed the events often recounted the encounter to friends and family, highlighting the importance of professionalism, fairness, and calm authority in public interactions. The FBI officer's actions had left a lasting impression on everyone involved. For the FBI officer herself, the incident was a reminder of the responsibility carried by her position. Each interaction, each public encounter, had the potential to influence outcomes significantly. Her ability to remain composed, assert authority respectfully, and document events accurately had ensured a positive resolution. The situation demonstrated the importance of preparation, training, and awareness, reinforcing her commitment to upholding justice and accountability in all circumstances. In the weeks following the incident, the officers continued their retraining and reflected on their mistakes. They understood that public perception, professionalism, and respect for individual rights were critical aspects of their responsibilities. The embarrassment and fear they had felt during the confrontation served as lasting reminders of how quickly assumptions and bias could lead to serious errors. Their careers would be shaped by this incident, hopefully guiding them to approach future situations with greater awareness and care. The FBI officer, while continuing her daily responsibilities, occasionally thought back to that day in the store. She remembered the initial accusation, the search, the officer's nervousness, and the moment her badge revealed the truth. She understood the significance of maintaining composure under pressure, not only for her own safety, but also to demonstrate how authority and professionalism could transform potentially dangerous situations into lessons in respect and accountability. Ultimately, the incident served multiple purposes. It provided a clear example of the consequences of bias and assumptions, demonstrated the effectiveness of calm, professional authority, and reinforced the importance of proper training and accountability for law enforcement officers. The FBI officer had navigated the situation with precision, patience, and integrity, ensuring that justice was maintained, both in the moment and in the formal after.